On March 6, 2026, 8 members of the US House of Representatives requested access to potentially UAP-related records allegedly held by the Department of War and the intelligence community. The All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, AARO, identified a collection of responsive materials held on a classified network. On May 22, 2026, the files were released to the public. What follows is official US government footage. The initial assessment paper for the US Senate in 2021 said that there were encounters which impeded military activities for the US on average once every 6 weeks, and it had been happening at that rate for the last 17 years. So there must be far more recent footage and far clearer footage.
Chile Control here again. Earlier in the flight, you'll recall at the start of the second revolution, we had a reference to several objects that the crew spotted. This was in the area of Antigua. Due to a mechanical breakdown, we did not have that portion of the tape available for you. This was a line breakdown between Building 30 and our news center in Building 6. Since then, we have dubbed the tape off the master tape here in the control center, and we are now prepared to play it for you. It contains references to sighting not only some particles, but as well as an unidentified object, plus the booster. Here's that tape. We'll play it for you now.
Gemini 7 here, Houston 98.
Loud and clear. 7, go ahead.
Bogey at 10 o'clock high.
This is Houston. Say again, 7.
So we have a bogey at 10 o'clock high.
Roger. Gemini 7, is that the booster or is that an actual sighting? Say again, 7.
So we have several, looks like the 3 up there, actual sighting.
You have any more information, estimated distance or size?
But we also have the booster in sight.
Understand you also have the booster in sight, Roger.
And we have very, very many, looks like hundreds of little particles going by from west out about 3 to 4 miles.
Understand you have many small particles going by on the left. At what distance?
4 miles. Looks like perhaps a vehicle that's disintegrated.
Roger, understand they're about 3 to 4 miles away.
They're past now, they're going to pull it over.
Roger, and understand they were about 3 to 4 miles away.
Try the pier line. No further.
Roger. Gemini 7, Houston. Were these particles in addition to the booster and the bogey at 10 o'clock high? Roger.
7, this is Houston, this is 7.
Go ahead.
I have the booster on my side. It's a brilliant body of the sun against a black background, and with billions of particles around it.
Roger, what direction is it from you?
It's about at my 2 o'clock position.
Does that mean it's ahead of you?
It's ahead of us, 2 o'clock, slowly doubling.
Roger.
Gemini Control here again. The reference in that conversation to the third unidentified object, of course, the third object was bogey. There were several references to the bogey. This is the unidentified object, in addition to particles which appear to be headed in a polar orbit, you heard Frank Borman say, plus Jim Lovell discussing the booster. It was Borman who reported sighting the bogey. This is Gemini Control Houston at 4 hours, 24 minutes into the flight.
And now at 1 hour at this time, I now have 1 hour and 21 minutes, and I am observing John's fireflies, 50 away from me.
I think one of the most interesting things to be released in the first tranche of declassified files in 2026 are the photographs of the UAPs that were filmed from the moon's surface. Because I think from the moment that the Apollo 11 astronauts did their press conference looking absolutely terrified, and Neil Armstrong looking terrified and simultaneously angry, people have been wondering, what were they threatened about? What was it they weren't allowed to mention? I think these photographs now tell us what they weren't allowed to mention. There were UAPs observing them all the time they were on the moon's surface. In all the years since the Apollo 11 landing, I think there's only been one leaked conversation from Neil Armstrong that suggested we were observed all the time we were there. Here is the photographic evidence to support that story, so we don't have to speculate anymore. They were in contact. I think we have to remember that that secrecy followed only months after the 1968 publication of the Condon Report, a scientific study of UFOs. And it was that report that had shut down official government investigation of UFOs. It had kind of debunked the whole subject in the concluding section of the report, disregarding all evidence to the contrary within the report itself. And so there was this strong ethic of we're not going to tell anybody anything at a moment when the world was listening to those three heroic astronauts to learn about the cosmos in which we live. And so a whole generation of disinformation began. Now that these photographs have been released, I'd love to hear from Buzz Aldrin, to hear him speak more freely about what it was they saw not only on the way to and from the moon, but while they were on the moon's surface. I would like to hear declassified the conversation between Alan Shepard and Ed Mitchell on the Apollo 17 mission. Sources I am close to were privileged to conversations that talked about footprints around the landing module after the astronauts' first sleep on the moon. This has never been discussed. Photographs have never been shown. Perhaps now is the time for those files to be released as well. The initial assessment paper for the US Senate in 2021 said that there were encounters which impeded military activities for the US on average once every 6 weeks, and it had been happening at that rate for the last 17 years. So there must be far more recent footage and far clearer footage. I think what's been released is interesting to see, and even though it's old news for those of us who've been following the story, I hope it gets the attention of people who have not realized before that US military intelligence has been sitting on film footage and retrieved materials for the last 80 years or so. These images are compelling, but where is the high-resolution footage held on CIFR, the Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility repository? Where is the high-resolution imagery to be found on the Secret Internet Protocol Router Network, or SIPR? Since the House Oversight Subcommittee hearing of July 26, 2023, we've known of the existence of entire craft in the possession of units operating under the aegis of US military intelligence. Where are the images of those? Since that hearing, we've known about pilots and non-human biologics. Where are the images of those? At the time of the hearing, there were more than 42 sworn witnesses from within the military intelligence community who had provided their sworn statements to Thomas Monheim, the Inspector General of the intelligence community. Where are the files relating to the artifacts that they had witnessed? We know that materials obtained through UAP retrievals have been studied, analyzed, that work is being done to reverse engineer them, this work undertaken by Boeing, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, Skunk Works, Lockheed Martin. Where are the files relating to that work? If scientists working on that legacy program are able to speak publicly, and they have, I'm talking about James Lukatsky, the American astrophysicist Eric W. Davis, the French information scientist Jacques Vallée, and Gary Nolan, the Stanford microbiologist, if they are able to speak publicly about their work on metamaterials, where are the files relating to that work? Now, it makes sense to have a scientist of the standing of Jacques Vallée and an astrophysicist of the standing of Eric Davis, but why a microbiologist? If you've got artifacts from UAPs, why do you have Gary Nolan looking at them? Why a microbiologist? Doesn't that tell us a little bit more about the non-human biologics, about the pilots, and maybe the nature of the craft? Where is the NASA footage of a giant cigar-shaped craft in our possession, viewed by Gary McKinnon in 2001 to 2002 at the Johnson Space Center Building 8? Why aren't we seeing files relating to that? Those who have spoken suggest that the way these craft operate involves a total interface between the mind of the pilot and the locomotion of the craft, that you can't get a piece of paper between the intention of the pilot and the movement of the craft. And so US naval pilots who've been deployed to engage with these craft, such as the Tic Tac craft of 2004, often comment that they seem to move as if they're little creatures rather than pieces of technology being driven. Again, as if you can't get a hair's breadth between the intention of the pilot and the movement of the craft. Where does the craft stop and where does the pilot begin? I think the question of what is being hinted at by this language of non-human biologics is rather interesting. More than 50 years ago, Josef Blumrich, working for NASA for the Advanced Propulsions Unit as the Director of Development, produced schematics for an extraterrestrial design of omnidirectional wheel. And the extraterrestrial design wasn't through a UFO retrieval. It was through reading the book of Ezekiel in the Bible and reverse engineering what was described there. The books I write are about paleo-contact, and I argue that what we're seeing today relates very closely to what our ancestors described in the deep past, and the shapes we're seeing, the flying disc, which in the past was described as a flying shield. In my book, The Eden Enigma, I show that the flying disc can be found in Bronze Age Iran and in the Armenian highlands of the Iron Age. Flying shields were understood to belong to visitors from the sky, the Dingir. The Dingir are described in ancient Mesopotamian lore. They are the sky people of ancient Sumer, Babylonia, Arcadia, and Assyria. And we have flying discs, flying shields. We have flying ziggurats or pyramids. And these correspond to Vedic stories of Vimanas. Cigar-shaped objects were described in the 1500s in the skies of Northern Europe. So these shapes are familiar to us. They have been for a very, very long time. And I think it would surprise people to know, when there's been so much publicity about the tic-tac shaped craft, that the most prevalent form in the present day is not the cigar, is not the tic-tac, is not the ziggurat or pyramid, but is still the flying shield, the flying disc. This is all domain anomaly. We're looking at craft that can travel through space, that can ping into our airspace, move through the air, and then move seamlessly into the water and under the water. And in some of the footage that was leaked in 2017, we hear from pilots who speculate about underwater bases to which these tic-tac craft are traveling and from which they're returning. Underwater bases is a story as old as the hills. In Escaping from Eden and the Scars of Eden, I talk about ancient Welsh story, ancient Ghanaian story, ancient Kenyan story, Hawaiian, Filipino story. They all speak about underwater bases that are home to a demographic that is not human and that has been on Earth for a very long time. The challenge for us is whether we can reproduce the materials from which these craft are made, because it seems that the materials themselves is the secret to their locomotion, that the materials from which they're constructed create a little aberration in space-time. They create a little space-time bubble. And that's what we want to be able to do, because in effect, if we can generate a stable wormhole, that's how we travel interstellar distances. We don't do it through driving through space or rocketing through space. We have to create this little aberration in space-time. And when we see the tic-tacs pinging into our airspace, that's what we're looking at. We're looking at a manipulation of space-time. And I think until we can do that, then the rules of engagement stay the same. Brigadier General Hamish Shed was for 28 years Israel's Chief of Space Security, and he put forward that view on the basis of his 28 years of privileged information. And what he had to say in his book, The Universe Beyond the Horizon, suggests that some of these retrievals are not us finding bits and pieces on the ground after crashes. Behind closed doors, we've been given stuff, and we've been told, see if you can make one of those. And I think when we can make one of those, that's when the rules of engagement change. I don't think there's any excuse in 2026 for people to be ignorant of the fact that we're in contact, that we've been in contact for 80 years in the modern iteration of contact, and that there is some kind of communication and collaboration that's gone on behind closed doors between covert layers of government and our ET visitors. One of the reasons I've written the Eden series is to try and bring more people into this awareness and into this conversation. I think we should all be asking, who is having these conversations behind closed doors? What decisions are being made? Who is making those decisions on our behalf? In whose interests are those decisions being made? And I think we need to pour the light of accountability on that, bring as much scrutiny to that as possible. Because I think as long as the public are excluded from even knowing about that, how can we expect decisions to be made in our interests? My field is ancestral stories, indigenous narratives, world mythology, and when we go to those for our ancestors' views on these things, it seems there's always been a plurality of visitors coming to this planet, a plurality of demographics who feel they've got a stakeholding in Project Earth, and some are more aligned with human welfare than others. I think we need to be aware of this. We need to be intelligent about this. We shouldn't be looking to the skies with horror and paranoia, but we should be thinking very clearly about who is best allied with our well-being, and are we engaging with that to the maximum? There's no excuse to be uninformed on this topic that we're in contact, but the churches are completely unready to have these conversations. I take my hat off to the Roman Catholic Church because it was 2009, 17 years ago, that they held their public symposium announcing that there was no issue in embracing alien life. And the repeated refrain was, we should be ready to embrace a brother or sister alien. Reverend Dr. Guy Consolmagno, the senior astronomer for the Vatican Observatory, said that we should be ready to embrace a brother or sister alien because they're in the Bible, they're in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And in my Books of the Eden series, I've sought to show that that is the case. The churches should be on the front foot here. They have an advantage that in the Bible, and the Jewish community too, have the Bible, the Torah, full of information about ancient contact when it's interpreted correctly. And I think that the churches are falling down on the job. They are letting people down who have seen things, who have followed the subject, who've had experiences, and at the moment the church is just gaslighting them, which I think is absolutely shameful. In my books, I show that ancient contact is absolutely central to the stories not only of the Bible, but of mythology all around the world. With flying ziggurats and pyramids in the Indian Vedas, in the carvings of Anatolia in Iran, flying discs in Iran, Syria, Turkey, Armenia, Iceland, and Sweden, and a memory of anomalous objects in the sky carried by artists all through the ages. These shapes are known to us. When people ask me, is anything new happening right now? I would say everything that's happening right now, our ancestors wrote about, and they left oral traditions behind to help us get a handle on what's happening right now, to give us a lens through which to understand what we're looking at. In my book, The Invasion of Eden, I show the connections between what's happening today in terms of contact and a slow release of information about contact, and what's happening geopolitically. Why is there so much financial stress upon people in the 21st century when we have the resources to create a totally different reality for people? Why is there a continuing devaluation of the currency in which people are paid for their work? Why are countries all around the world pursuing a long-term policy of pulling people off the land and into denser population centers? Why do democratic nations have general elections to find that the same corporations and the same families are still pulling all the strings? How does this connect with an understanding that we are in contact and that our elected prime ministers and presidents have been kept out of the loop? Remember, President Trump had to request for this declassification. He's appealing to an authority higher than himself. Please, could you tell us a little bit more? Let's think a little bit about what that means. Who's running the show here? Who's in charge? Why are there these layers of classification higher than kings and presidents and prime ministers? And who's calling the shots at that level? No one who reads my Books of the Eden series will be surprised by anything that's been released this year. And no one who studies ancestral stories should be surprised, because stories of contact are embedded in the mythology of every culture on every continent. In my studies, I've looked at Welsh narratives, Scottish narratives, Spanish, Portuguese, Filipino, Hawaiian, Iranian, Armenian, West African, East African, Caribbean, Indian, Northern European, Aboriginal Australian, stories from New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, the First Nations of North America, the Southern Cone of Africa, the Yucatan Peninsula, South America. There is nowhere you can go on the planet where indigenous stories don't emerge of contact with the kind of craft we're seeing today and with the non-human biologics who travel in them. In The Invasion of Eden, I show that it's impossible to understand what is in our skies today and what's happening in our geopolitics today unless we begin to recognize the stories of contact that our ancestors bequeathed to us. They told these stories so that we would know how to handle what is happening right now. Not go to pieces, not be confused, not be disoriented, not be full of fears about national security, but to understand that there is the potential in contact for tremendous leaps forward in the human story. Our ancestors who left behind stories and carvings in the Iron Age were very aware of the positive side of the spectrum, those who've helped Homo sapiens in ages past, those who've looked out for the welfare of human beings. We need to make sure that that is part of the conversation that's going on behind closed doors today. We're being drip-fed with information that we're in contact. We need to push the conversation to the next level. Who is in contact? Who is having the conversations? What are they about? What decisions are being made? Who's making the decisions on our behalf? and in whose interests are those decisions being made. When we see a declassification of files relating to those things, then we'll be talking. If these subjects interest you, let me encourage you to join me at ancientknowledgeacademy.com, where we do deep dives into these questions in courses, live classes, and one-on-one conversation. If you'd like to join me in Turkey in October to see the carvings that I believe tell us to look to the skies more expectantly for contact of a positive kind, go to ancientknowledgetours.com, and I'll look forward to sharing those amazing places with you where there are live excavations happening while we visit, and the work of the archaeologists in uncovering new layers of our history are finding artifacts that speak directly to this question of the deeper story of humanity. For a shorter tour, come with me and PRAVEEN MOHAN to Thailand in November, where we'll be visiting temples with carvings that tell these same stories, and together we will sit in front of the carvings and decode what the ancients left for us. With everything happening in the skies in the 21st century, we have not arrived here unprepared. In the Eden series, I show that our ancestors have given us ample information to understand what's happening in the present and to chart a better way forward in the future.